Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. When people talk about game design, one word comes up all the time: depth. A game gets praised for being deep, a mechanic gets defended because it's deep, and sometimes a rules-heavy system gets treated as if its sheer density is proof of quality. But depth and complexity are not the same thing, and mixing them together can make it harder to evaluate what a game is actually doing. So, in this video, I want to explore a simple question. When does a game become genuinely deep, and when is it simply asking us to manage more moving parts? That distinction matters for designers, for game masters, and for anyone trying to understand why one game feels rich and rewarding while another feels busy and overbuilt. So let's get into it. Game design theory gives us some useful tools here. Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman argue that games become meaningful through actions and outcomes that players can perceive and connect to the larger system, which gives us a strong way to think about why some choices feel significant in play. The MDA framework, developed by Robin Hunicki, Mark LeBlanc, and Robert Zbeck, also helps because it reminds us that mechanics are only one layer of a game. What matters is the play experience those mechanics generate. And from a cognitive perspective, John Sweller's work on cognitive load helps explain why dense systems can place real demands on attention, memory, and processing during play. So let's start with complexity. For this discussion, I'm using complexity as a working term shaped by the theorists already mentioned, with the understanding that words like complexity and depth are used somewhat differently across game studies, design practice, and player communities. In game design, complexity usually refers to how much information a player has to learn, track, remember, and process in order to participate effectively. That can include the number of rules, the number of exceptions, the amount of bookkeeping, the density of procedures, and the number of interacting parts in the system. From the perspective of cognitive load theory, all of that matters because human attention and working memory are limited resources. The more a system asks players to hold in mind at once, the more mental effort it demands during play. And to be clear, complexity is not automatically a flaw. Some games use it really well. A detailed combat engine, a layered magic system, or a game with highly specific character options can create texture, specialization, and a strong sense of system mastery. Complexity can support simulation, granularity, and niche differentiation. It can also appeal to players who enjoy dense rules and the satisfaction of learning a large mechanical structure. The important point is that complexity tells us something about the cost of engaging with a game. It tells us how much processing the system demands. By itself, though, it does not tell us whether those demands lead to meaningful decisions, memorable tension, or richer play. That is where depth enters the conversation. I'm using depth again as a working term with the understanding that different designers and scholars sometimes use the word in slightly different ways. So, if complexity is about how much a system asks you to process, depth is about how much a system gives you to think about. A game feels deep when it creates meaningful decisions, choices with real trade-offs, uncertain outcomes, and consequences that connect to the larger flow of play. That idea lines up well with Salen and Zimmerman's concept of meaningful play, where player actions matter because their results are both discernible and integrated into the wider system. It also fits the MDA framework, which reminds us that mechanics are only one layer of design. What matters in play is the dynamic behavior those mechanics generate and the experience that emerges from them. This is also why Sid Meier's famous phrase still holds up: a good game is a series of interesting decisions. That line is useful because it pushes us away from counting rules and toward looking at the quality of choice. A game can have a small rule set and still feel deep if it consistently asks players to weigh risk, timing, resources, position, trust, or long-term consequences. On the other hand, a large rule set can still feel thin if the best move is obvious most of the time. So for this discussion, depth is not about volume, it's about decision space. It's about whether the game keeps opening meaningful possibilities as players engage with it. That's the kind of richness players usually mean when they say a game has staying power. To make this more concrete, imagine a combat system with a long list of actions, multiple situational modifiers, several damage categories, detailed timing rules, and plenty of exceptions. On paper, that can look rich. It can feel technical and substantial. But if actual play keeps steering people toward the same obvious tactic, or if most turns end up as minor variations on one safe choice, then the game may be highly complex without offering much real depth. You can see the same pattern in other parts of design as well. A character creation system might include dozens of talents, feats, subclasses, or advancement options, but if most of them funnel players toward a handful of clearly superior builds, then the system has a lot of content without opening much real decision space. A crafting system might ask players to track ingredients, tool qualities, recipe tiers, and production times, yet still produce items that are functionally straightforward and rarely lead to interesting strategic choices. A social mechanic might include layered influence rules, attitude shifts, and multiple conversational actions. But if the best approach is almost always to stack bonuses and push the highest persuasion value, then the interaction may be complex in procedure while staying shallow in play. You sometimes see it in exploration as well. A travel system can include weather tables, fatigue rules, terrain modifiers, navigation checks, encumbrance limits, and supply tracking. But if the practical answer is always bring as much as possible, move carefully, and rest whenever you can, then much of that machinery may be creating management without creating many genuinely live choices. A good way to put it is this: a game can have procedural density without strategic richness. There can be a lot to track, a lot to remember, and a lot to execute while the actual play experience remains narrow. More machinery does not automatically create more play. The other side of this is just as important. A game can be fairly simple and still feel deep. A small rule set can create a rich play experience when the decisions inside it carry uncertainty, trade-offs, and consequences that continue to matter as play unfolds. Greg Costigan's work is especially relevant here. In Uncertainty in Games, he argues that uncertainty is central to what makes games engaging, and he identifies several forms of uncertainty that designers can work with, including analytic complexity, performative uncertainty, and narrative anticipation. That matters for this discussion because a system does not need a huge number of rules to produce meaningful tension. It needs situations where players are genuinely weighing possibilities and cannot fully predict the outcome. This also connects back to Salin and Zimmerman's idea of meaningful play. If actions have consequences that players can perceive and that continue to matter within the larger system, then even a relatively light mechanic can produce depth. A simple resolution rule, for example, can feel surprisingly rich if success carries a cost, if failure changes the situation, or if each decision shapes what becomes possible next. You can see this in a lot of different places. A combat system with only a few options can still feel deep if those options create strong trade-offs. Attack, defend, withdraw, or assist an ally may be a short list, but if each choice changes positioning, resource use, and future risk, then the decision space can stay rich. A social system can also be simple and deep if the real question is not which bonus to stack, but whether to reveal information, make a concession, threaten, appeal, or wait. Even exploration can work this way. A travel procedure with only a few rules can still produce depth if players must choose between speed and safety, stealth and visibility, or short-term comfort and long-term preparedness. The same principle applies in narrative games. A mechanic as simple as choosing whether to press forward, accept a complication, or back off can carry a lot of weight if each option changes relationships, resources, or the shape of the scene. In those cases, the depth is not coming from the number of moving parts. It's coming from the fact that the player is facing a meaningful question with no perfectly safe answer. So, a game does not need to be sprawling to be deep. Sometimes depth comes from a compact rule set that keeps generating interesting questions. Part of the reason these ideas get blurred together is that complexity can look like depth from the outside. A dense rule set often signals seriousness. It can give the impression of realism, sophistication, and mastery. If a game has many subsystems, many edge cases, and a long learning curve, players may assume there must be a great deal of richness waiting inside it. And sometimes there is. But the presence of many mechanics does not tell us by itself what kind of play experience those mechanics actually produce. The MDA framework is helpful here because it separates mechanics from the dynamics and aesthetics that emerge in play. That distinction matters since a game can accumulate rules without generating more interesting decisions or a stronger play experience. There is also a psychological side to this. When a system demands a lot of attention, memory, and processing, that effort can create a sense of weight or importance. Sweller's work on cognitive load helps explain why that feeling exists. High processing demands are real demands. They can make a game feel substantial even when the actual decision space is fairly narrow. In that sense, complexity can create the sensation of texture even when it's not opening into much additional depth. And then there is a broader design culture issue. People often count content more easily than they evaluate consequences. It's easy to notice that a game has 50 feats, 12 status conditions, and a highly detailed equipment list. It takes more work to ask whether those things generate meaningful play, in the Salin and Zimmerman sense, where actions and outcomes connect clearly to the larger system. That is one reason complexity so often gets mistaken for depth. It's visible. Depth usually reveals itself over time through play. This distinction matters a great deal in tabletop role-playing games because these games often carry complexity in several places at once. Character creation, combat procedures, resource tracking, spell lists, advancement systems, and game master facing tools. So when we ask whether a tabletop RPG is deep, I think the better question might be, what kinds of decision does this game keep putting in front of players? And how much do those decisions actually matter once play begins? One useful way to evaluate a mechanic is to ask two questions at the same time. How much mental effort does this rule require, and how much meaningful play does it create in return? Cognitive load theory works for the first half of that question because it gives us a way to think about processing demand. If a rule asks players to track many interacting parts, remember exceptions, and manage several pieces of information at once, it raises cognitive load. That does not automatically make it a bad rule. It does mean the rule is asking the table to spend attention, memory, and mental energy. The second half of the question comes from the game design side. Salin and Zimmerman's idea of meaningful play pushes us to ask whether player actions have consequences that are visible and integrated into the larger system. The MDA framework adds another useful layer since mechanics matter because of the dynamics and experiences they generate in play. So a rule earns its place when the mental work it demands produces meaningful choices, tension, uncertainty, or a more compelling play experience. That gives us a strong practical principle. A good mechanic earns its complexity. If a rule opens up real trade-offs, supports multiple viable approaches, reinforces the game's themes, or creates memorable tension, the cognitive cost may be well worth it. If a rule mostly adds bookkeeping, slows play, duplicates another mechanic, or rarely changes anyone's decisions, then its payoff may be too small for the effort it demands. So if depth is about meaningful decision space, the design goal is not to pile on more moving parts. The goal is to build systems that keep generating interesting choices without asking for more procedure than the experience itself can justify. If you're a game master, this distinction matters even if you're not designing a whole RPG from scratch. A game master can add complexity at the table without meaning to. That can happen when a scene carries too many details at once, when modifiers keep stacking, when several subsystems arrive all at the same moment, or when players are asked to track more information than they can comfortably hold in working memory. Depth works differently. A game master creates depth by putting players in situations where their choices matter. That can mean presenting multiple viable solutions, making consequences real, building uncertainty into the scene, and creating pressure that forces genuine trade-offs. So, one of the most useful things a game master can remember is this: depth at the table often comes less from rules density and more from situation design. A well built situation with tension, consequences, and multiple possible responses can create deep play experience even inside a fairly light rule set. So, if you want to use this idea in your own design work, here is one way to think through it. First, identify the decision you want the player to make. Before adding rules, ask what kind of choice the mechanic is supposed to create. Are players weighing risk against safety, speed against caution, personal gain against group benefit? The heart of the question is whether the player's action will actually matter inside the larger system. If you cannot clearly name the decision, there's a good chance the mechanic is still too vague. So, for example, if you're designing a survival mechanic, the core decision may be: do we spend resources now for short-term safety, or save them and accept greater danger later? That is already pointing toward more depth because it creates a real trade-off. Next, ask what makes that decision difficult. A choice becomes interesting when the answer is not obvious. Costigan's work is meaningful here because uncertainty is one of the main things that keeps games engaging. If every player can immediately tell what the best move is, the decision may be present on paper but absent in practice. So, for example, in that same survival game, maybe lighting a fire keeps the party warm and reduces exhaustion, but it also risks revealing their position to enemies. Now the decision has tension. Next, check whether the consequences continue to matter. Depth grows when choices echo forward. A rule that resolves and disappears may still be useful, but it usually creates less depth than a rule that changes later play. So, for example, if players choose to travel fast, perhaps they reach the destination first, but they arrive fatigued, low on supplies, and less prepared for what comes next. The decision now has an afterlife. Now ask how much information the mechanic asks players to track. A mechanic may be worth that effort, but you want to know what it is costing the table. So, for example, if your survival rule needs 4 separate meters, weather tables, encumbrance math, and special exceptions for terrain, you may be increasing complexity faster than you're increasing depth. Next, ask whether the mechanic earns that cost. This is the key design test. The mechanic earns its complexity when the mental effort it demands produces meaningful decisions, live uncertainty, or richer play dynamics. So, for example, a detailed morale system might be worth keeping if it changes how players position allies, spend resources, negotiate, or retreat. If it only adds one more thing to mark on the sheet and rarely changes decisions, it may not be doing enough work. Next, remove anything that does not change play. This is where many designs get sharper. If a rule adds procedure, bookkeeping, or explanation, but does not create a new trade-off, a new uncertainty, or a new consequence, it may just be clutter. That does not mean every simple rule is good and every detailed rule is bad. It means the rule should justify its place. So, for example, if you have 3 nearly identical wound conditions that all produce the same practical behavior at the table, you may only need one. Next, test for multiple viable responses. A system feels deeper when players can approach the same problem in different ways. If one strategy quickly becomes dominant, the mechanic may have complexity without much decision richness. This fits the broader design logic behind meaningful play and interesting decisions. So, for example, a stealth encounter feels deeper if players can sneak, bribe, distract, split up, force a confrontation, or create a diversion. If the structure quietly rewards only one of those options every time, the depth narrows. Next, evaluate the experience, not only the rule. This may be the most important habit of all. What matters is the dynamic behavior and player experience that emerge during play. A rule may look elegant on the page and still feel flat at the table. A simple rule may look modest in isolation and still produce great tension once players begin interacting with it. For example, a very small push or luck rule may generate suspense, table talk, hesitation, and celebration. That's a lot of payoff from very little machinery. So the practical workflow is this: identify the decision, create uncertainty, connect consequences forward, measure the cognitive cost, and then ask whether the mechanic actually changes play enough to earn its complexity. Let's look at some homework exercises. Find the real decision. Take one mechanic from your game and write down in a single sentence the actual decision it creates for the player. Then ask, what is the player choosing between? What does each option offer? What does each option cost? Is there any real uncertainty here, or is one answer obviously best? If you cannot clearly identify the trade-off, the mechanic may be adding procedure without adding much depth. So for example, instead of saying, this is my encumbrance system, try saying, this mechanic forces players to choose between carrying more gear and staying fast enough to escape danger. That gives you a much clearer sense of what the whole rule is doing. Cut one rule and test the game. Pick one rule, modifier, subsystem, or tracking element from your design and temporarily remove it. Then ask, what meaningful decision disappears? What tension disappears? What experience becomes weaker? Does the game actually lose anything important? If removing the rule changes very little, that may be a sign that the mechanic is not earning its complexity or its place. So for example, take out a minor environmental modifier from combat. If no one's decisions change and the scene still plays the same way, that modifier may have been doing cognitive load without adding much depth at all. So when you look at a game, a mechanic, or even your own design notes this week, try asking a slightly sharper question. Do these rules create meaningful decisions, uncertainty, and consequences that matter in play, or do they simply ask the table to manage more moving parts? That one distinction can tell you a lot about why a system feels rich, flat, engaging, or overloaded. If this video gave you something interesting to think about, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop them in the comments section below. Have you played games that felt complex without much depth? Have you seen very simple systems create surprisingly rich play? Let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.